when David Thompson became trapped between two massive boulders in a remote Utah canyon. He faced an impossible choice that no human should ever have to make. With no hope of rescue and death closing in after 3 days, this experienced hiker did something so extreme and shocking that it redefined what the human will to survive really means. But how do you find the mental strength to deliberately cause yourself unimaginable pain when it's the only thing standing between you and certain death? The morning sun cast long shadows across the jagged landscape of Utah's remote Blue John Canyon as David Thompson shouldered his worn hiking pack and began his descent into the narrow slot canyon. At 28 years old, David was an experienced outdoorsman who had spent countless weekends exploring the desert wilderness of the American Southwest. But on this crisp April morning, he was about to embark on a journey that would test every ounce of his survival skills and force him to make decisions that would shock the world. The canyon walls rose nearly 80 feet on either side of him, their red sandstone surfaces carved smooth by millions of years of flash floods and erosion. The passage was so narrow in places that David had to turn sideways to squeeze through, his backpack scraping against the ancient rock. Above him, the strip of blue sky seemed impossibly distant, like looking up from the bottom of a deep well. The silence was absolute and almost supernatural. No bird calls, no rustle of wind through vegetation, no distant hum of civilization. The only sounds were David's own breathing, the soft crunch of his hiking boots on the sandy canyon floor, and the occasional echo of loose pebbles cascading down the walls when his pack brushed against them. It was the kind of profound quiet that city dwellers never experienced, a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. David had chosen this particular route because of its isolation and technical challenges. Blue John Canyon was known among experienced hikers as one of Utah's hidden gems, a place where you could hike for hours without seeing another human being, where the landscape remained exactly as it had been for thousands of years. It wasn't marked on most tourist maps, and accessing it required several miles of hiking across open desert just to reach the canyon entrance. The temperature was perfect for hiking, cool enough to prevent overheating, but warm enough that David wore only a light long-sleeve shirt and hiking pants. His pack contained enough water for a full day of hiking, some energy bars, a first aid kit, and basic camping gear in case he decided to spend the night under the stars. He had told his roommate he might be gone until Sunday, giving himself plenty of flexibility to explore the canyon system at his own pace. As he moved deeper into the canyon, the walls grew higher and the passage narrower. In some sections, he could extend his arms and touch both sides simultaneously. The rock formations were breathtaking, layers of red, orange, and yellow sandstone that told the geological story of ancient seas and shifting continents. Smooth curves and flowing lines had been carved by water over millennia, creating natural sculptures that rivaled anything in the world's greatest art museums. David paused frequently to take photographs, marveling at the way sunlight filtered down from above and illuminated the canyon walls in constantly shifting patterns. He was an amateur photographer who loved capturing the raw beauty of wilderness areas, and Blue John Canyon was providing him with some of the most spectacular subjects he had ever encountered. 3 hours into his hike, David reached a section where the canyon narrowed to barely 3 feet wide. A massive boulder, roughly the size of a refrigerator, had become wedged between the canyon walls about 8 feet above the floor, creating a natural bridge overhead. Below the boulder, smaller rocks had accumulated over the years, creating an obstacle course that required careful navigation. David studied the passage ahead, planning his route through the jumbled rocks. It looked challenging but manageable, the kind of technical scrambling that made canyon hiking exciting rather than just a walk in the desert. He took a drink from his water bottle, adjusted his pack straps, and began working his way through the rocky maze. The first several moves went smoothly. David stepped from rock to rock, using his hands for balance and occasionally bracing himself against the canyon walls. His hiking boots provided good traction on the sandstone surfaces, and his experience in similar terrain gave him confidence in reading the rock and finding secure footing. But as he approached the area directly beneath the suspended boulder, the spacing between rocks became more difficult to navigate. David found himself reaching farther for each step, stretching his legs to span gaps between stable surfaces. He was about halfway through the obstacle when he spotted what looked like a good handhold on the canyon wall, a narrow ledge that would give him the leverage he needed to make the next move. What David couldn't see from his position was that reaching for that handhold would require him to squeeze through a gap between two large rocks that was narrower than it appeared. As he committed to the move, extending his right arm toward the ledge and shifting his weight forward, his body slipped into the gap between the rocks. The sensation was initially just uncomfortable, a tight squeeze that required him to exhale completely to fit through. But as he tried to continue the movement and pull himself forward, David realized with growing alarm that his right arm was completely stuck. The gap that had seemed wide enough for his body to pass through had narrowed considerably once he was inside it, and the weight of his backpack was preventing him from backing out. David's first reaction was mild annoyance rather than panic. He had been in tight spots before and had always been able to work his way out through patience and careful maneuvering. He tried shifting his weight from side to side, hoping to find an angle that would allow him to slip free. He attempted to remove his backpack, thinking that eliminating its bulk might give him the extra space he needed. But as minutes passed and his situation remained unchanged, David began to understand that he was facing something far more serious than a temporary inconvenience. His right arm was wedged between two rocks at the elbow, with his forearm and hand extending into a cavity he couldn't see. His torso was twisted at an awkward angle, with his left side pressed against one rock face and his right shoulder jammed against another. His legs were supporting most of his body weight, but they were positioned on uneven surfaces that were already causing his muscles to cramp. The full horror of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just temporarily stuck. He was completely trapped, held fast by thousands of pounds of immovable rock in one of the most remote locations in Utah. No one knew exactly where he was. His roommate wouldn't expect him back until Sunday, which was still more than 36 hours away. And even when people realized he was missing, the chances of anyone finding him in this particular slot canyon were virtually zero. David's breathing became rapid and shallow as panic began to set in. He pulled frantically at his trapped arm, ignoring the sharp pain that shot through his elbow and shoulder. He braced his feet against the rocks and tried to use his leg muscles to generate enough force to break free. But the stone was immovable and unforgiving. His struggles only seemed to wedge him more tightly into the gap. "Help!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls and disappearing into the depths above. "Somebody help me!" But even as he called out, David knew it was pointless. The nearest hiking trail was miles away, and the chances of another person venturing into this remote canyon system were essentially zero. As the initial wave of panic subsided, David forced himself to think systematically about his situation. He was a mechanical engineer who had built his career on solving complex problems through logic and analysis. Surely he could apply those same skills to finding a way out of this predicament. He began by carefully examining everything within his field of vision, looking for any detail that might suggest a solution. The rocks that held him trapped were sandstone, worn smooth by centuries of erosion. There were no obvious cracks or weak points that might be exploited. The gap that imprisoned his arm seemed to narrow even further beyond where he could see, eliminating any possibility of pushing forward through the opening. His backpack, while not directly contributing to his entrapment, was preventing him from twisting his torso in ways that might create additional space. But when he tried to remove it, David discovered that the straps were caught on rock projections behind him, and his limited range of motion made it impossible to work them free. The water bottles in his pack were tantalizingly close. He could hear them sloshing when he moved, but they might as well have been on the moon for all the good they did him. David could turn his head enough to reach one of the bottles with his mouth, but the angle was so awkward that he could only manage small sips, and much of the water ended up running down his chin and soaking into his shirt. As the hours passed, David's initial desperation gave way to a more calculated assessment of his chances for survival. He had perhaps 2 liters of water within reach, enough for maybe 2 days if he was extremely careful. He had a few energy bars in his pack, though accessing them would be even more difficult than reaching the water. The temperature in the canyon was moderate during the day, but would drop significantly at night, and his current position would make it difficult to maintain body heat. More concerning than the immediate physical challenges was the growing realization that no one would be looking for him anytime soon. His roommate knew he was hiking, but had no idea which canyon system David had chosen to explore. Even if a search was initiated, the vast network of slot canyons in the area would take weeks to explore systematically. David was beginning to understand that if he was going to survive this ordeal, he would have to find a way to free himself. As the sun moved across the narrow strip of sky above him, David experimented with different positions and techniques. He tried using his free left hand to push against the rocks, hoping to create enough space to slide his right arm out. He attempted to use his hiking poles as levers, though the awkward angles made it nearly impossible to generate meaningful force. He even tried digging at the sandy debris around the base of the rocks, thinking that removing some material might change the way his body was positioned in the gap. Nothing worked. If anything, his struggles seemed to settle him more firmly into the trap. The rocks showed no signs of movement, and David's energy was being depleted with each failed escape attempt. As darkness began to fall on his first night in the canyon, David was forced to confront the possibility that he might die in this remote place. The thought terrified him not just because of his own mortality, but because of what it would mean for the people who loved him. His parents, who had always worried about his solo hiking adventures. His younger sister, who looked up to him as her role model and protector. His girlfriend Sarah, who had been planning to move in with him next month. David found himself thinking about Sarah as the temperature dropped and the canyon plunged into complete darkness. They had been dating for 2 years and had talked about getting married, though no formal engagement had taken place. She had always been supportive of his hiking hobby, even though she preferred activities that didn't involve the risk of getting lost in the wilderness. Sarah was a nurse who worked in the emergency room at the local hospital, and she had seen enough preventable tragedies to make her cautious about unnecessary risks. "You know, I worry about you when you go off on these solo trips," she had said just the week before, as David planned his route through the Utah canyons. "Promise me you'll be careful and stick to the marked trails." David had kissed her forehead and assured her that he always carried proper safety equipment and never took unnecessary chances. Now, trapped and alone in the darkness, he realized how naive that promise had been. Wilderness emergencies didn't always result from reckless behavior. Sometimes they were just the product of bad luck and circumstances beyond anyone's control. The night seemed endless. David dozed fitfully, jerking awake whenever his muscles cramped or his position shifted enough to send new waves of pain through his trapped arm. The canyon temperature dropped into the 40s, and without the ability to move around to generate body heat, David began shivering uncontrollably. He tried to wrap his free arm around his torso for warmth, but the awkward position provided little relief. By morning, David's right arm had gone completely numb from the restricted blood circulation. He could no longer feel his fingers, and when he tried to move them, he couldn't tell if they were responding. The lack of sensation was both a relief. It eliminated the sharp pain that had tormented him through the night, and a terrifying indication of how serious his situation had become. David knew from his first aid training that prolonged loss of circulation could result in permanent nerve damage or even the death of tissue. If he remained trapped much longer, he might lose the use of his arm entirely. The thought spurred him to renewed efforts to escape, but his weakened condition made it even more difficult to generate the force needed to break free. As the second day wore on, David's mind began to play tricks on him. Dehydration and stress were affecting his mental clarity, causing him to hear voices in the wind and see movement in his peripheral vision that wasn't really there. He found himself having conversations with people who weren't present, explaining his situation to his parents, apologizing to Sarah for the worry he was causing her. It was during one of these hallucinatory episodes that David experienced a moment of clarity that would change everything. As he imagined explaining his predicament to his father, a retired Army engineer who had taught David to approach problems methodically, he suddenly realized that he had been thinking about his situation in the wrong way. Instead of trying to pull his arm out of the gap or push the rocks apart, what if he could change the fundamental nature of the problem? What if the solution wasn't to escape the trap as it existed, but to modify his own body to fit through the opening? The idea that formed in David's mind was so shocking, so extreme, that he initially dismissed it as a product of his deteriorating mental state. But as he continued to analyze his situation with renewed focus, he began to understand that it might be his only realistic option for survival. David's right arm was trapped at the forearm, just below the elbow. The gap between the rocks was wide enough to accommodate his upper arm and shoulder, but his forearm was too thick to slide through the narrowest point. If he could somehow reduce the size of his forearm, he might be able to slip free. The solution that David was contemplating was amputation, cutting off his own arm to save his life. The idea was horrifying beyond description, but David forced himself to consider it logically. He had a multi-tool in his pocket that included a small but sharp knife. The blade was only about 3 inches long and wasn't designed for the kind of work he was contemplating, but it was better than nothing. He also had basic first aid supplies in his pack, including bandages and antiseptic that might help control bleeding. More importantly, David had some medical knowledge from his years of wilderness hiking and emergency response training. He understood the basic anatomy of the arm and knew that cutting through bone would be extremely difficult with improvised tools. But he also knew that if he didn't attempt something drastic soon, he would die of dehydration and exposure in this remote canyon. For hours, David wrestled with the decision. The thought of deliberately causing himself such massive trauma went against every instinct for self-preservation. But as his condition continued to deteriorate and his hope for rescue dwindled, the brutal logic of his situation became impossible to ignore. On the morning of his 3rd day in the canyon, David made his decision. Working with his left hand, he managed to extract the multi-tool from his pocket and open the knife blade. His hand was shaking from dehydration and fear, but he forced himself to remain calm and methodical. If he was going to attempt something this extreme, he needed to do it correctly or risk making his situation even worse. David began by using the knife to cut through his shirt sleeve, exposing the trapped arm. The skin was pale and cold from the restricted circulation, and he could see that swelling had made the entrapment even more secure. There was no longer any possibility of the arm slipping free on its own. He then used strips of fabric from his shirt to create makeshift tourniquets above and below his elbow, hoping to reduce blood loss when he began cutting. The process was awkward and painful, requiring him to tie knots with one hand while bracing the fabric against his body. What happened next tested the limits of human endurance and determination. David began the agonizing process of cutting through his own arm, starting with the skin and working his way through muscle and sinew. The pain was indescribable, far beyond anything he had ever experienced. Several times he had to stop and rest, fighting waves of nausea and the overwhelming urge to abandon the attempt. The small knife blade became dull quickly against bone, forcing David to work with increasingly inefficient tools. Blood loss, despite his improvised tourniquets, was significant in adding to his growing weakness. At several points, he lost consciousness briefly, coming to with his head slumped forward and fresh blood on his clothes. But somehow, through sheer force of will and the desperate desire to live, David continued the horrific task. Hour by hour, cut by cut, he worked his way through the trapped limb. The process took nearly 6 hours of intermittent work, with frequent breaks to rest and manage the pain. When the final cut was complete and David's arm came free from the rocks, the relief was overwhelming. He had done it. He had actually amputated his own arm and freed himself from what had seemed like certain death. But his ordeal was far from over. David was now bleeding heavily from the amputation site, despite his makeshift bandages. He was severely dehydrated, weakened by blood loss, and still miles from any help. Using his remaining strength, he applied pressure to the wound and began the dangerous process of climbing out of the canyon with only one arm. The ascent that would normally have taken him 20 minutes now required more than 2 hours. Every movement sent waves of pain through his body, and the blood loss made him dizzy and nauseous. Several times he nearly fell, which would have been fatal in his weakened condition. But the knowledge that he had survived the worst of his ordeal gave him the motivation to continue. When David finally reached the canyon rim, he could see his truck parked in the distance across the desert floor. The sight of that familiar vehicle, representing safety and the possibility of rescue, brought tears to his eyes. But he still had to cross nearly a mile of rough terrain to reach it. The walk to his truck became a final test of his determination. David stumbled and fell repeatedly, each time forcing himself back to his feet and continuing forward. His vision was beginning to blur from blood loss, and he was having difficulty thinking clearly. But the truck grew larger with each step, and the promise of rescue kept him moving. When David finally reached his vehicle, he discovered that his ordeal still wasn't over. Starting the truck and driving with only one hand proved to be another significant challenge, particularly given his weakened condition. But years of driving experience allowed him to adapt, and he managed to navigate the rough desert roads back towards civilization. The first people to see David were a family of tourists at a roadside gas station. The sight of a man covered in blood, missing an arm, and barely conscious behind the wheel of the pickup truck was so shocking that several witnesses initially thought they were seeing the aftermath of a terrible accident. It took precious minutes for someone to call 911 and for paramedics to understand that David needed immediate emergency surgery. David was rushed to the nearest trauma center, where a team of surgeons worked for hours to stabilize his condition and properly treat the amputation site. The medical team was amazed that he had survived it all, given the severity of his injuries and the primitive conditions under which he had performed this surgery on himself. The fact that he had then managed to climb out of the canyon and drive himself to safety seemed almost superhuman. During his recovery, David's story spread rapidly through news media and social networks. The extreme nature of his self-rescue, amputating his own arm to escape certain death, captured public imagination in a way that few survival stories ever had. He was featured on television news programs, interviewed by magazines, and invited to speak at conferences about wilderness survival and human resilience. But David was reluctant to embrace his role as a media sensation. The experience had changed him profoundly, giving him a new appreciation for life and relationships that made the attention feel somewhat trivial. He was more interested in processing what had happened to him privately and figuring out how to move forward with his life than in becoming a public figure. The physical recovery was challenging but manageable. David was fitted with a prosthetic arm that restored much of his functionality, and he worked with physical therapists to adapt to his new reality. The emotional recovery proved more difficult. David struggled with nightmares, anxiety attacks, and a complicated mixture of pride in his survival and trauma from what he had been forced to do to himself. Sarah, his girlfriend, stood by him throughout the recovery process. Their relationship had been strengthened by the crisis, and they were married the following year in a small ceremony attended by family and the medical team that had saved David's life. Sarah often said that while she wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, it had shown her the depth of David's character and determination. David eventually returned to hiking, though he never again ventured into remote areas alone. He became an advocate for wilderness safety, working with hiking organizations to develop better emergency protocols and communication systems. His story became part of wilderness survival curricula, illustrating both the importance of preparation and the incredible lengths to which humans will go to preserve their lives. The canyon where David had been trapped became something of a pilgrimage site for extreme hikers and survival enthusiasts. Park officials eventually installed warning signs and emergency communication equipment in the area, hoping to prevent similar incidents. Some visitors came seeking to understand how someone could make such an extreme decision, while others simply wanted to see the place where one of the most remarkable survival stories in history had unfolded. Reflecting on his experience years later, David often emphasized that his survival had not been the result of any single decision or action, but rather a series of small choices that had accumulated into something extraordinary. The choice to remain calm when panic would have been natural. The choice to think logically about his options when emotion would have been easier. The choice to endure unimaginable pain for the possibility of freedom. People always ask me how I found the courage to cut off my own arm, David would say in interviews. But courage wasn't really the right word. It was more like clarity, a moment when I understood exactly what my options were and what each choice would cost me. I could die with my arm intact, or I could live without it. When you put it in those terms, the decision becomes obvious. David's story had become more than just a survival tale. It was a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the lengths to which people will go to preserve life and return to the people they love. In choosing to sacrifice his arm rather than his life, David had demonstrated that sometimes our greatest victories require our greatest sacrifices, and that true strength is often measured not by what we can endure, but by what we're willing to give up for the chance to keep fighting.